Welcome, gun runner.
The Philips CDI is a console that seems to get a great deal of hate on the internet these days. In fact, it seems to be one of those consoles, along with the likes of the Atari Jaguar and Sega Mega CD, that it seems fashionable to deride. In fact, when I was researching this video, I was absolutely flabbergasted to discover that famous American video games magazine GamePro ranked it as the 4th worst selling console of all time, when in reality it wouldn't even make the top 20. Absolutely laughable journalism, and one of the main reasons why people probably think in this way. Yes, the CDI was a console with an identity problem, and yes, it certainly had its faults, but it was far from a terrible console and had a much better games library than people give it credit for, as I previously went into somewhat in my 10 amazing Philips CDI exclusives video, which I've linked down below. It's also a console that I have a great deal of nostalgia for personally, as we had one on the end of the countertop when I worked for Game back in the day, and I spent many hours playing on it when the store was quiet. I also own one of my own in the present day too, which I've also looked at on the channel, and when I decided to massively slim my collection down when I got married 10 years ago, it was one of the consoles that survived that purge. It seems that there's a certain fondness for it from my viewers too, if the most recent Amazing Facts poll is anything to go by, as it romped home with 34% of the vote, quite easily beating off the advances of the RCA Studio 2, Xbox and Nintendo Virtual Boy. This pleased me greatly, because it's been narrowly beaten the last 2 times it appeared, so I finally get to give this grossly underrated console the love it truly deserves.
This may look like an ordinary compact disc, but actually, it's an interactive encyclopedia. A stimulating match with a tennis pro. An interactive adventure through fantastic worlds. A glimpse into the world of Vincent van Gogh, or even a feature-length Hollywood movie. This is CDI, Compact Disc Interactive, a new world standard in multimedia home entertainment from Philips Electronics. You might expect to pay over $1,000 for an entertainment system that does this much, but now you can own a Philips CDI player for only $499. You can choose from more than 100 interactive titles by world-renowned publishers. CDI titles start at just $15. During this special TV promotion, we'll include Compton's Interactive Encyclopedia on disc, a $299 retail value, yours free during this limited time offer. Call the number on your screen now for a free brochure and for the location of your nearest CDI retailer.
Philips, let's make things better.
I think it's wise to start with a brief history lesson, because I'm always shocked how many people don't realise that Philips actually co-created the CD format itself, often wrongly attributing all the credit to their partners on the project, Sony, who, despite being best known for the PlayStation brand these days, played a hugely important part in the CDI story too. So it's only right that the co-creators of the CD format itself would also develop the first standalone CD-based console. The origins of the compact disc actually go way back to 1913 with the invention of a device called the optophone that used light for both recording and playback of sound signals on a transparent photograph. However, it would be over 30 years before the concept was taken further when an American inventor named James T. Russell created the first system to record digital media on a photosensitive plate. Russell's patent application was filed in 1966 and granted in 1970, which ended up in him licensing his technology to Sony and Philips, though not until a lot of litigation from Russell, who accused them of stealing his invention. Sony and Philips claimed the technology they were working on was in fact based on laser discs and not Russell's own invention, but that didn't hold up in court, where it was acknowledged that while Laserdisc could have influenced the development of the CD, the way the format worked was far more similar to Russell's patent. The first CD players hit the market in 1982 to much amazement. They were less than half the size of bulky Laserdiscs and could still store 74 minutes of high quality audio. But behind the scenes, both Philips and Sony knew that music wasn't the only thing that CDs could be used for, as there was also the potential to store extremely large amounts of data and even video. So in 1984, they started work on the next evolution of the CD that would harness both these potential applications. This new type of CD would be able to combine audio, text, data, graphics and video to become the very first attempt at true multimedia. The companies joined forces to develop a draft standard at the beginning of 1985, and later that year Matsushita joined in to work on the development of the integrated circuits the players would need. The first public announcement of the new product, which would henceforth be known as Compact Disc Interactive, came in March 1986 at the first industry conference to promote CD-ROM in the United States. The provisional standard, called the Green Book, was issued 2 months later in May. A fully functional specification of the system was issued later that year, with the first CDI discs and prototypes being demonstrated to potential licensees 3 months after that. In autumn 1988, the very first CDI players will be thrust into the hands of developers and previewed to the press to much excitement. However, we would have to wait until December 1991, over 5 years after the CDI project was first announced, to get our hands on a retail unit. This was partly down to ironing out problems with the technology itself, but the huge cost involved in producing the new format was also proving problematic, and both Philips and Sony knew they had to get this price down before they could take it commercial. This is also the reason why the actual capabilities of the CDI weren't quite as advanced as people expected when it was finally released in 1991, as it was originally slated for a 1988 debut, when it would have seemed a lot more impressive.
Philips, let's make things better.
And now for your second history lesson today, because as well as talking about Philips' incredible innovation of the compact disc format itself, it's also important to mention their legacy in the video game sector, because it was a combination of both these things that led to the creation of the CDI and its use as a games machine, as well as a multimedia based set-top box. To tell this part of the story properly, we need to go back to 1972 to witness the release of the world's very first home console, the Magnavox Odyssey, which proved surprisingly successful and opened up the market for others to come in and have a go too. The Odyssey was of course designed by the one and only Ralph Baer, who's often called the founding father of video games for his contributions to the industry, and anyone who knows anything about the great man knows that he wasn't one to sit on his laurels and continue to play around with all sorts of different technology concepts. In 1974, Magnavox were taken over by Dutch electronics giants Philips, who saw a lot of value in the concept of video games, choosing to plough vast sums of money into research and development, all headed up by Ralph Baer. In 1975, the Odyssey 100 was released, a standalone Pong clone, and then numerous other plug-and-play consoles soon followed, all following that same concept. But the market soon became flooded with these Pong clones, and Philips knew that they would need to come up with something else. So in 1976 they began to develop the Philips Video Pack, which would also be known as the Magnavox Odyssey 2. And the original concept for this was a standalone console with around 25 built-in games. But after seeing the arrival of the Fairchild Channel F, the first console to use ROM cartridges, and hearing that Atari had their own similar console waiting in the wings, they knew they would need to expand this project further, and we all know what the result of that was, don't we? The console became a big success for Philips and actually finished in third place during its respective generation, only being beaten out by the behemoth that was the Atari 2600, which nobody was going to catch, and the much more powerful Mattel Intellivision. Sales were reported to be just over 2 million units worldwide, but that doesn't tell the whole picture, as its biggest market was undoubtedly Europe, where it finished second only to Atari. If you want to know more about the Philips Video Pack and Odyssey 2, as well as the unreleased Odyssey 3, then check the links in the description as I've covered them extensively. Ralph Baer sadly passed away on the 6th of December 2014, aged 92, but his legacy in the console arena through the Odyssey systems will never be forgotten. It's also worth mentioning that Philips were actually the only European electronics company to sign up to the successful Japanese MSX standard, along with former partners Sony and Panasonic, as well as many other mainstream electronics manufacturers like Sharp, Pioneer, Yamaha, Casio, JVC and Mitsubishi. They would produce both MSX and MSX2 computers, as well as a range of software and add-ons, and this venture would prove far more lucrative and successful than their own range of computers like the P2000 and VG5000. One last interesting point to end this section on is that in 1983, when Warner first announced that they were looking to sell off Atari, Philips were the first company to show significant interest, and some pretty advanced negotiations took place too. However, Philips were uncomfortable with the level of debt within the company, so eventually pulled out of the deal. You do wonder how different things would have been had this takeover gone ahead. Atari CDI, anyone?
Philips, let's make things better.
Without doubt, one of the biggest selling points of the CDI was its ability to play video CDs with the addition of a digital video card. But the add-on ended up being so much more than that, because as the system evolved, it was also required for many of the CDI's best games, and some other video-intensive software too. So I better explain just what made the DVC so essential. The cartridge itself featured MPEG-1 video decoding, a separate 32-bit processor, and an extra 1.5 megabytes of memory. It was this extra processor and additional memory that saw it also utilised for more advanced games later on to help the CDI keep up with the competition a bit better. Depending on what model CDI you had, you would need to buy the correct DVC, because they weren't all compatible with each other. Some later units actually came with them pre-installed. Also created by Sony and Philips alongside the CDI standard itself, Video CD allowed you to store up to 74 minutes of video on a CD with comparable video quality to a good VHS player of the time, but with better audio, which made it ideal for music albums with video, a lot of which appeared on the format. However, that 74-minute limit did cause some problems with films, which often came on more than one disc, forcing you to get up and switch the CD over halfway through. Not exactly ideal, but manageable. The format ended up being very successful in Japan, but not so much in the rest of the world. Although the CDI was the first home system to have the option of video CD, many other consoles also offer compatibility via their own MPEG cartridges, including the 3DO, Sega Saturn, Amiga CD32 and Sony PlayStation 1. Unfortunately, the video CD standard was fairly short-lived, as continued development of the format by Sony and Philips led to the creation of DVD, which was released in Japan in 1996 and soon took off, pretty much killing off video CD for good.
Philips, let's make things better.
One thing that always amazes me about the CDI is the sheer amount of different models that there are to choose from. And once you come away from the more common and bland range of machines like the 220, 450 and 470, you come across some absolutely incredible variations that add a variety of different features into the mix too. So in this section I'm going to mention some of the very best. First up we have the Biocenter AV5, which is possibly the coolest of them all, and possibly also one of the coolest consoles ever, full stop. Only released in Europe, this one has a serious wow factor, because this isn't just a box for playing games on, it's an entire media centre. From top to bottom, there is a nice sized 25-inch TV screen, stereo speakers that slide out from each side, an LCD display panel, and last but certainly not least, a CD player on the top left of the unit. And this is the best part of all, because this isn't just any old CD player, it's a CDI player that is 100% compatible with the Philips format, including photo CD, video CD and CDG. Developed by B&O in Denmark, it was available in 6 different colours: pearlescent black, pearlescent blue, pearlescent green, pearlescent red, pearlescent tan and silver. The coloured models are much more unusual than the black and silver, but they are all highly sought after by collectors and can go for big money when complete with the remote in fully working order. At the start of this video I mentioned Sony's involvement in both the development of the compact disc itself as well as the CD interactive standard. So it should come as no surprise to learn that Sony also produced 3 different models of the CDI themselves that were very different to their rivals, and this is because they were both portable. To differentiate their own players, Sony called them intelligent discmen, with both the IVO V10 and IVO V11 featuring built-in LCD screens, while the IVO V12 model did not. The V11 was merely an upgrade of the V10 that had some improved features, while the V12 was created mainly for professionals to carry around with them to demonstrate CDI-based products in different locations. This of course could be connected to any standard TV. It's quite hard to find these Sony models in good working order now, but when they do turn up, they tend to fetch pretty high prices. Like Sony and B&O, Philips themselves also produced CDI consoles that were built into TVs too, as well as some portable players, but neither were as stylish as the ones I already mentioned. But one model they did create that certainly has the wow factor is the FW380i, which as you can see is a big black all-in-one hi-fi unit, complete with bass-busting speakers. This is just the kind of thing that teenage me would have loved to have had in his bedroom, but have never been able to afford. Last of all, I want to mention one much more mysterious model that Philips produced exclusively for the commercial market, and that is a touchscreen version of their 21 TCDI 30. These were made to be used in information kiosks in places like shopping centres and car dealerships, and probably the very first example of a touchscreen games console. These models seem to be very elusive indeed, but there used to be a video online that showed a whole row of them in a warehouse of somebody who used to supply them to interested parties, but I can no longer find it, so it seems it's been taken down sadly.
Philips, let's make things better.
This next amazing fact leads on very nicely from the last one, as it further explores all the different CDI models out there. I've already talked about how the CDI standard came about, and how 3 of the biggest names in home electronics came together to make it happen. But it's also worth mentioning that Philips, Sony and Panasonic Matsushita weren't the only companies to support the format, as lots of other companies also signed on the dotted line to license the CDI standard and release their own range of compatible players. These included a mix of really famous names and more obscure companies, some choosing to copy the existing design stylings used by Philips, whilst others such as Bang & Olufsen, who I just talked about, did something pretty radical with the technology. Probably the biggest name outside the main 3 to follow their lead was LG, who released 4 different models under both the LG and Gold Star monikers in their home territory of South Korea, including a rebranded version of the console-like CDI 450 called the GDI 750. Another big name to sell their own CDI players was Tandy, under their Memorex brand, which is quite funny when you also consider that they created their own very similar multimedia box in the form of the horrendously bad Memorex VIS, which I covered in a video some time ago. I'll link that one down in the description for those who want to know more about one of the biggest failures in console history. German electronics company Grundig, best known for their cheap 14-inch TVs, produced their own version of the CDI 220. Philips' Japanese partner Kyocera manufactured several different models, and other lesser known names to make their own players included Vobis, NBS and Digital Video Systems Inc., whilst all of the Philips players were also sold under the Magnavox brand in North America of course, where that brand was a lot more relevant.
Philips, let's make things better.
And let's follow on from the last entry once again, because I've mentioned the CDI 450 in passing a few times now, but it's a model that I really need to talk about separately because it marked a big turning point for Philips in both the way they marketed the console themselves and also how it was perceived by the media and consumers alike. You see, for the moment the CDI hit the market, Philips were always adamant that the CDI was not a console. It was an interactive multimedia system that you would buy to replace your VHS player, CD player and even your home computer. Philips promised that it could be used for all your entertainment needs, which did also involve games of course, but it was most certainly not a console. They even tried to ram this point home by only selling the CDI through home electronics retailers and not traditional video game stores, and when they did release games for the system, they were titles that were very much aimed at or would more appeal to adults, like puzzle games, board games, golf and other sports, quiz and trivia titles, or strategy games. I can clearly remember being stopped from playing on the display CDI in my local branch of Dixon's because the console wasn't, and I quote, made for kids. So I just had to stand back and drool in amazement at the visuals on Palm Springs Open as somebody else played it. But within a few years of the CDI's launch, it was clear that the system was struggling in the market, having failed to sway people away from their VHS players, CD players and home computers. A big problem was the cost. Another problem was that the technology wasn't quite ready for what people needed, and the people Philips were trying to market the system to didn't really understand what it was or why they really needed one. As 1993 came around, a host of new CD-capable systems had either been released or just around the corner, and Philips decided they needed to jump on the bandwagon if the CDI was going to be a success. The answer was indeed the 450, a new version of the system that looked like a games console rather than a VHS player, had a flip-top lid instead of a motorised drawer, came with a proper controller and was much cheaper to produce. Debuting at the 1994 CES show in Chicago, it got a somewhat lukewarm reception, with a lot of people feeling it was just too late to market and should have been released at least a year earlier. You already had the Sega Mega CD, Amiga CD32, 3DO, NEC Turbo Duo and Atari Jaguar on the market, with the Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn just around the corner. It was a 16-bit console in a world that was turning 32-bit. But despite many reservations about its release, Philips' financial might and retail presence meant that they got into every possible retail outlet out there, with the CDI being sold in traditional game stores for the first time too. They also released a glut of new games to go alongside the unit, including ports of hugely popular games like Mad Dog McCree, Flashback, Lemmings, Dragon's Lair and Namco arcade classics, as well as some great original titles too, like Mutant Rampage Body Slam, The Apprentice, Steel Machine, Voyeur and of course Burn Cycle, which certainly helped matters. It could of course play all existing discs and still use the digital video card to play video CDs, so there was already tons of available software to use with it, which was another big bonus. Sales did improve a great deal, so much so that a console that many people considered dead managed to carry on for another 4 years, with Philips not discontinuing the CDI officially until 1998. The overall sales just about breaking the 1 million mark.
Philips, let's make things better.
When people talk about the CDI, they often talk about how bad its controller is, saying that it makes playing games almost impossible, but most of them don't seem to realise that the so-called lollipop controller was never intended for games at all. It was a simple multimedia pointing device for things like video discs, encyclopedias and educational products. There is in fact a whole range of different controllers that are more than up to the task of playing console or indeed computer-like games, and are worth examining here for those that are unaware. Firstly, we have a Philips branded version of the Gravis pad that was very popular amongst PC owners of the age. This is the controller that came with my own CDI, and it features 4 face buttons, a small thumbstick that can be unscrewed, and a switch you can turn it upside down and use it left-handed. This was only offered as an additional purchase, which is why they are so hard to find. The more common and easier to acquire joypad is the Mega Drive-like one that came bundled with the more console-like CDI 450, which I just talked about of course. In terms of more normal controllers, there was also a pretty standard computer-like mouse and even a joystick, which are even harder to find these days than the joypads. And of course the Peacemaker light gun, which came bundled with Mad Dog McCree and is much easier to come across. What is interesting about the Peacemaker is that technically speaking it's not actually a light gun, it's a motion controller, as it uses a small box you place on your TV to track your movements rather than the beams of light from the TV screen. This was actually the first motion control device created for a console, and is actually referenced in the Nintendo Wii patent, where Philips made a small royalty from every console Nintendo sold. The last one I want to mention is probably the most interesting of all, and that's the brightly coloured and rather large roller controller, which is designed specifically for games aimed at young children. As you may have guessed from looking at it, this is actually just a trackball, just like the ones used in arcade games like Centipede and Marble Madness. Very cool indeed.
Philips, let's make things better.
Earlier on in this video, I talked about how the CDI was conceived as an all-in-one multimedia set-top box that would replace your VHS player, hi-fi and home computer, giving you all the functionality of those and more. And of course, the release of the CDI also came about around the same time as the World Wide Web arrived, and Philips knew that they would need to capitalise on this, even if it took them a bit longer than expected to do so. In October 1995, we finally saw the release of CD Online in the UK, with other Western countries soon following for a price of just under £100. It was subsequently launched in other European countries like France, Belgium and the Netherlands in March 1996, before being launched in the US a few months after that, where it was renamed WebEye. The package contained a 14.4K modem supporting software on CD and all the cables needed to connect it. It also required the digital video cartridge and wouldn't work without it. Philips boasted that this new service would bring full internet access to the living room on standard TV screens and offered online play on selected CDI titles. But the add-on was soon criticised for its incredibly limited capabilities by the official UK CDI magazine. In fact, I will quote you the exact words of their writer Andy Stout because they tell you everything you need to know. It is very much internet light. The main advantages are that it's cheap, probably working out at a third of the cost of a PC or Mac solution, and incredibly user-friendly. The downside though is using a browser that doesn't support Netscape, and coping with all the drawbacks of the machine's minuscule memory. You can only ever access 10 articles on Usenet at a time. It'll only support 80 bookmarks maximum, and for all that trouble, all your saved games, preferences and high scores will have been written over in the internal memory. It's got the full access right now, but with only about 40% of the functionality, which will probably be fine for people who don't know what they're missing, but the virtual keyboard is a complete nightmare to use too. Only one game was ever released that took advantage of the much promised and publicised online play, the technically impressive first-person shooter Ram Raid, which was later improved and turned into the offline game Atlantis Last Resort. Although the CDI was officially discontinued in 1998, the CD Online service did actually stay in operation in the UK until the year 2000, and in the Netherlands it was supported right up until 2007. I'd love to know how many people were actually still using it by then though.
Philips, let's make things better.
Now I'm sure we all know the story of the unreleased Nintendo PlayStation, the CD-ROM for the Super Nintendo that was created by Sony only to be cancelled just as it was ready to go into production. It's been talked about ad infinitum on the internet over the years, and we have a couple of very expensive prototype consoles out there to drool over too. But you rarely hear people talking about what replaced the Nintendo PlayStation, and that was to be a similar device that was being developed by Philips, of course. As much as you might like me to, I'm not going to go into that particular subject too much here, more the impact it had on the CDI itself, because that was a pretty big deal and a lot more relevant to this video of course. What I will say is that it made perfect sense for Nintendo to turn to Philips after things went sour with Sony. They were the co-creators of the CD format of course, and just as well equipped to provide the goods as their long-term technology partners, even if the decision did make Sony even more angry and adamant to beat the big N at their own game, which they did. A deal was signed between Philips and Nintendo in 1991, but cancelled just a year later, which led to a lengthy legal battle between the two companies, with Philips suing Nintendo for breach of contract. This was eventually settled out of court, with Nintendo granting Philips the rights to make up to 10 games based on the company's popular franchises, including the likes of Super Mario, Zelda and Donkey Kong. Philips even published adverts in magazines at the time boasting about this deal. The only exclusion was that Philips couldn't port any existing games, they had to create their own, and all games had to be signed off by Nintendo before release. I think we all know what became of this. Firstly, we got the three infamous Zelda games in Wand of Gamelon, Faces of Evil and Zelda's Adventure, with the first two and their FMV scenes in particular becoming the stuff of legend. We also got the excellent and highly underrated Hotel Mario 2, which was actually adapted from an existing project being created by the developer, the Fantasy Factory, that itself was somewhat of a sequel to an unreleased but complete Atari 5200 game called Looney Tunes Hotel. A second, more traditional Mario game was also being developed by Nova Logic 2, called Super Mario's Wacky Worlds, which was loosely based on the SNES game Super Mario World. Unfortunately, the project was beset by problems, most notably when the majority of the team behind it left to join other companies. It was eventually cancelled in March 1993, which is a great shame, as it showed real promise, which you can see for yourself in the leaked prototype. There was also a Donkey Kong game in development too, which is reported to be a 16-bit remake of the original arcade game called Super Donkey Kong, with loads of extra levels and some new features. However, the artist on the project has stated that it was actually going to be a scrolling platformer more like Donkey Kong Country, so these reports are conflicting. It seemed to suffer similar problems to Wacky Worlds before being cancelled completely in mid-1993. No prototype has ever been found despite confirmations that the game was indeed worked on. Interestingly, the cancelled contract for Philips to provide Nintendo with a CD-ROM add-on wasn't the last such deal that the Dutch company would enter into, as in 1993 they also signed on the dotted line to develop and manufacture the Jaguar CD for Atari. I go into this particular story in a lot more detail in my Amazing Facts video for that failed add-on, so if you want to know more, then follow the link I've added for you down in the description.
Philips, let's make things better.
This last entry is something quite interesting because it's something that you never see talked about, and secondly because the information out there is quite vague, so it leads to a lot of what ifs and what could have beens. In 1994, with CDI sales waning and new consoles coming onto the horizon, Philips didn't just release a new lower cost model of the console in the form of the 450, which I already talked about of course, they also put plans in place for a much more advanced CDI 2. We don't actually know an awful lot about this new console as I said, but what we do know is actually very interesting indeed. You see, Philips actually contracted Argonaut Software to develop a new 3D capable chipset to be used in the new machine, and if you think you recognise that name, then you should, because not only were Argonaut early pioneers in 3D gaming with games like Starglider 1 and 2, they also developed the Super FX chip for Nintendo and developed a number of impressive 3D games for the company too, including the likes of Star Fox, Stunt Race FX and Vortex. This adds yet another connection between the Philips CDI and Nintendo, and it would have been fascinating to have seen what this machine would have been capable of. The only other feature we know about was that it would have included an upgraded MPEG-2 quality digital video card as standard. Unfortunately, the console was cancelled before it even reached the prototype stage when Philips chose Cor Boonstra as their new president, and he had long been critical of the CDI and the huge amounts of money that Philips had wasted on it. In fact, one of his first actions was to cease all ongoing support for the format, leading to it being officially discontinued in 1998. From here, he agreed to sell Philips Studios all their games IP and the trademarks for the CDI, Videopack and Odyssey consoles to French company Infogrames, and indeed, it would be the modern owners of the Atari brand that would release the last official CDI game, Solar Crusade, in 1999. After sitting on these properties for years, Atari agreed to sell all the former Philips trademarks and IP to British businessman Paul Andrews in 2019. He has since re-released numerous Philips properties including Voyeur, International Tennis Open, Mystic Midway and a collection of Videopack games too. There were rumours of both a Videopack Mini and CDI Mini from Paul's other company Retro Games Limited, who already did a Commodore 64, Amiga, ZX Spectrum and Atari 8-bit Mini of course, based on this acquisition, but so far nothing has been forthcoming sadly.
Philips invents CDI. From now on, television isn't just something you watch, it's something you do. Philips invents for you.
And that rounds up my look at 10 amazing Philips CDI facts. But which of these fabulous facts was your favourite, or are there any tantalising tidbits of trivia that you'd like to add yourself? I always love to hear the thoughts and views of my audience, so please get typing in that comments section. Before I go though, I must thank all of my loyal patrons and YouTube members for continuing to support my channel and make videos like this possible. However, I must give special thanks to the following people in particular for their much appreciated pledges. Dee Vaughan, Albert Davis, Richard Baker, Martin Wiggins, Peter Grantham, Bernard Santu, Mins, Classic Gamer 74, Josh Hartman, Donald Skoronsky, Ben P. Stein, Tebby Kitsune, Grady Haynes, Paul Daniel, Serthey Robinson, Kalima Torn, Carl Olsen, Mark Strickland, Big Chuzzle, Carl Cloping, Black Siren, John Alberino, Krispy Kreme, Justin Cooney, Luke Boynton, Sarah B, Richard Tate, Tellboy 2011 and Electron Star Collapse. If you also want to help support this channel, you can now join as a member for as little as £2 a month, where you'll get access to exclusive videos and updates and much more besides. Just click the button on my community page to get started. My Patreon is also still available if you'd prefer to support me in other ways too. I've been the Laird, I thank you for watching, I'll see you all again for another video very soon.